Are you wondering why generations of United States trade policy seems to be curious how all of this is going to impact our trade relationship with the European Union? And are you also trying to make sense of all of the chaos coming from the White House right now? Yeah, fantastic. Me too. So let's try to take a look. So before we actually begin diving into what all of these tariffs potentially mean for our trade relationship with the European Union, I think we should first try to put these tariffs within the context of the American economy.
Then in 1913, for reasons unknown to mankind, they established the income tax so that citizens, rather than foreign countries, would start paying the money necessary to run our government. Then in 1929, it all came to a very abrupt end with the Great Depression, and it would have never happened if they had stayed with the tariff policy.
So yes, Trump is actually mostly correct here. Tariffs aren't new, and they used to be a bigger part of the United States federal budget. Levying taxes on imported goods was the most important source of revenue for the federal government in the 19th century. It's estimated that tariffs provided as much as 95% of the revenue for the federal government. But even way back then, tariffs weren't actually all that great of a source of income for the United States government. And if you're personally sitting at home, waiting, hoping, wishing that these Trump tariffs are your ticket out of paying income tax, yeah, I wouldn't hold your breath. If the US were to turn back to tariffs as its primary way of generating income, it would run into a math problem pretty fast. Even conservative and libertarian think tanks that are proponents of lowering income taxes agree that the maximum amount of money a blanket tariff regime could raise in a single year probably wouldn't be enough to pay for any major federal spending category. Not Social Security, not Medicare, not Medicaid, and certainly not defense. Tariffs made sense 150 years ago because back then, the US government was a lot smaller, and we were mostly an agrarian society. Tracking what everyone made and then taxing that income would have been really difficult to do. But in the 150 years of radical change that our country has undergone, we've seen things like the introduction of the income tax, and of course, the Industrial Revolution. But I would caution anyone who wants to harken back to yesteryear, even as recently as just the 1950s, and think of it as some kind of golden age of American manufacturing and use it as a baseline when discussing making America great. Even in the mid-20th century, the US wasn't necessarily the global powerhouse of manufacturing because we were the best at it. We just had a pseudo-monopoly on it at the time. European factories were largely piles of rubble, and Asia had not yet emerged as a major global producer. While, yes, deindustrialization has occurred in the United States, we also just have more competition for where that production can take place now. That's the free market for you. But more recently, say just in the last 25 years since we've let China into the WTO, we've pursued an economic model that says more free trade always, regardless of what happens to the American worker, regardless of what happens to American industry. We want cheap stuff. And to Trump's credit, I think there is fair criticism to levy by saying that this has been really damaging to certain sectors. But as a society, we have grown to love buying cheap goods, and our economy has flourished because of all of this spending. But you cannot have your locally made cake and eat it too without massively increasing the price and killing jobs in the process. And you don't need to take my word for it, just look back to Trump's first presidency as proof of this in practice. During his first term, Trump slapped a 25% tariff on imported steel, hoping to bolster US steel production. And hey, guess what? It worked! The higher price of foreign steel increased demand for US steel, raising overall US manufacturing employment by 0.3%. But not so fast. American-made products that use raw steel or steel products, like cars, appliances, farm equipment, and construction materials, became more expensive to manufacture and production fell, leading to a drop in US manufacturing of 1.1%. Retaliatory tariffs on American goods further depressed production, leading to a net loss of U.S. manufacturing jobs of 1.4%, according to a 2019 Federal Reserve Board study. Oxford Economics estimated in 2021 that this test round of tariffs reduced U.S. household income by an average of $675 a year. And it's also worth mentioning that those tariffs were plainly illegal, and this current round of tariffs are most definitely as well. Under World Trade Organization guidelines, member nations commit to tariff bindings, which set maximum tariff levels that cannot be exceeded unless renegotiated. These commitments, outlined in each country's schedule of concessions, ensure stability and predictability in trade. While countries may impose lower applied tariffs, they cannot raise them above the bound levels without violating WTO rules. Now, that being said, countries can evoke emergency provisions, such as those that are necessary for national security measures. During his first presidency, the Trump administration cited national security under Section 232 of the U.S. Trade Act to impose those additional tariffs. The WTO, however, later ruled that these measures violated international trade rules, stating that national security clauses must not be applied arbitrarily. After all, you shouldn't be able to just invoke wartime powers when you aren't actually at war with anybody. Despite the ruling, the U.S. refused to reverse the tariffs, asserting national security as a sovereign matter. Washington then blocked appointments to the WTO's appellate body, effectively paralyzing any other country's appeal process. Which makes the whole situation all the more frustrating because there really is this sort of consensus feeling here in the European Union especially that the United States is just being a bully and not a friend. After all, the United States invented the game. The United States made the rules. They are the biggest and most powerful player. And they started the conflict. Yet when it was time for the rules to apply to them, they just simply threw the rule book in the trash. Listen, every economic system has winners and losers. But the free trade system, which has dominated the globe in the 21st century, thanks in large part to the WTO, has allowed countries to focus on economic activities in which they have a comparative advantage, such as advantages with natural resources, human resources, and capital resources. But the question specifically when it comes to the European Union, at least in the United States, is whether or not this is fair. But before we dive into the numbers, I want to give a huge thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Incogni. One of the biggest culture shocks that I personally experienced when I moved from the United States to Germany was just how serious the Germans take their Datenschutz, or data security. Or perhaps how freely and open Americans seem to be with theirs. Records on people from major search sites like Been Verified and White Pages can include a wide range of information from addresses and political beliefs to property records and financial data. So I was curious, what could I find about myself on some of these websites? So down the rabbit hole I dove, and I uncovered that quite a lot of my past history in the United States was still published online for anyone to see. Now, interestingly, there was a lot of also inaccuracies that I found on these websites attributing me to addresses that I have never lived in, but there was enough correct that this would clearly expose me and those I love to risks such as scams, identity theft, online harassment, and stalking. Now, the good news is that we actually have the right to demand that our name and information be taken off of lists like this. The bad news is that it tends to be pretty laborious to do it. But thanks to Incogni, I don't have to be worried about this happening again because they do the legwork for me and take me off of the lists. Seriously, I didn't have to do a thing. Just sign up and give them permission to act on your behalf, and then they go out and find the list that you're on and start demanding that you be taken off. If any of these data brokers push back, Incogni continues to push them until all of your information is deleted from these lists. I actually signed up for their services a little while back when they approached me about wanting to sponsor a video, and I have been incredibly impressed on how far they've gone to protect my identity since then. And I can actually use their dashboard to see them working in real time as they continue to work to guard my privacy. So if you too want to take back your privacy, use the code Ashton and click the link down below in the description of this video to get 60% off an annual plan of Incogni today.
The EU has been very tough over the years. I always say it was formed to really do damage to the United States in trade.
Earlier this month, President Donald Trump announced a reciprocal 20% tariff on EU goods entering the United States, claiming that the 27-country bloc is, quote, ripping America off, end quote, by charging a 39% levy on U.S. products entering its market. Okay, listen, first things first, the European Union does not impose a 39% tariff on EU goods. This is just
fake news.
The European Commission says it charges an average tariff of just 1% on U.S. products entering the EU market. A WTO estimate puts this average tariff rate on U.S. products entering the EU slightly higher at 4.8%. Tariffs depend largely based on which goods specifically you're looking at, and you're going to see varying percentages depending on whether or not the volumes of those products are also taken into account. But regardless of how you calculate the tariff rate, pretty much every single credible economist agrees that that rate is nowhere near 39%. And listen, please, I'm not going to get into the weeds on this because it largely isn't relevant, but VAT specifically is not a tariff. It's a fair, non-discriminatory sales tax. Now, that isn't to say that there isn't asymmetry in certain tariff rates. Some countries use protective tariffs to help shield nascent sectors from foreign competition and promote economic development. Think of it like a David versus Goliath clause on foreign trade. The U.S. administration, however, says that this is unfair. And one of the most commonly cited differences in tariff rates is the 2.5% tariff that the United States was imposing on imported vehicles from the European Union, while the EU, on the other hand, was imposing a 10% tariff rate. And yes, okay. However, I would like to point out that that statistic, at least how it's being largely presented, is pretty misleading. It fails to consider the fact that the US was already imposing a 25% tariff on foreign pickup trucks in order to promote economic development of US companies like Ford, Dodge, and GMC. And for somewhat obvious reasons, the US 25% tariff on EU pickup truck imports wasn't that big of a deal. Yes, the American pickup truck market is huge, but it is overwhelmingly dominated by American brands. Even here in the German market, the Ford Ranger is still the most popular pickup truck, holding a market record of 53.9% in 2024. So when Trump says things like
Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen, BMWs, they're sending millions and millions of cars into the U.S., but we don't have a car.
He is factually incorrect. He's just stirring the pot. But the broader point worth making is that, yes, asymmetry exists, but it isn't entirely lopsided either. And advanced economies like the United States typically apply lower tariffs as their industries are globally competitive. The US is the big dog, so to speak, in many industries. We buy the most, we sell the most, and so we don't need to apply tariffs in order to subsidize a market. Open trade policies offer nations like the United States broader market access with minimal restrictions. Both the EU and the United States have always had, to some degree, lopsided tariff agreements depending on the good that you happen to be examining. And perhaps one of the biggest trade imbalances that actually favors the United States might be the most telling: military weapons and machinery. Now, I'm not saying this to be dramatic in my criticism, but truly, chaos is a fair description of the Trump administration's strategy. The way they've been rolling their tariffs and trade policies out leaves far too many questions and has been extremely volatile for the stock markets. If you want to impact international trade productively while not tanking the markets and hurting industries in the process, you need certainty and predictability and clear communication. However, I personally hold the viewpoint that hurting the market is actually probably very well the intended strategy of the Trump administration in the long term. There was actually a wonderful video that was done by Money and Macro that I'm going to include down below in the description of this video, and I encourage you to check it out. Because in this video, he ultimately speculates that the tariff chaos is just phase one in a world order restructuring with the goal of other countries tying the value of their currency to the US dollar in order to weaken the dollar while simultaneously keeping it as a reserve currency. In other words, the utter chaos and market tanking will be used as leverage in the negotiating process, where countries in economic areas like the EU will agree to some manner of currency accord in exchange for a reduction of tariffs. That is a direct quote, by the way, from A User's Guide to Restructuring the Global Trading System, written by Stephen Miran, who is the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for the Trump administration. This, of course, is speculative, but he makes a very convincing argument that there could be a foreseeable outcome where countries agree to appreciate their currency if the dollar gets too strong, and in exchange, they get access to the US market and perhaps even security guarantees. And this probably feels familiar to you if you're here in Europe. But if we work forward from this theory, one could make the logical conclusion that this trade war with Europe has actually little to do with reciprocating European trade tariffs or punishing European trade at all, but much, much more to do with thwarting de-dollarization, reorganizing the current structure of NATO, and promoting the US military-industrial complex. I mean, after all, if we take the Trump administration's team at their word, specifically in their not-so-secret group chat, which is to label Europeans as freeloaders, then setting up a financial world order which makes global peace and European defense dependent on ensuring financial superiority for the US dollar, makes sense. European nations already procure nearly 2/3 of their military equipment from US suppliers, supporting US manufacturing and, in return, reducing per-unit costs of high-ticket defense items. However, as the United States has repeatedly stated their intentions to pull back its military presence from the continent, European countries are highly likely to strengthen their own military-industrial complex. For example, the Rearm Europe policy. This will rob the US defense sector of customers and transform Europe into a potential competitor in the global defense export ecosystem. The recent freezing of military aid to Ukraine has already prompted the Europeans to question their reliance on the American military supply chain, with Canada and Portugal mulling canceling their F-35 fighter jet orders. At the same time, French President Macron suggested the Rafale as an alternative. However, at the end of the day, this is just speculation. At the time of recording this video, I have no way of knowing with certainty that if these Trump tariffs are a genuine opening offer for negotiation, or if they just plan on remaking the world with no intention of repairing the current systems.
We have major breaking news into CNN on the global trade war. President Trump just truthed out saying, quote, "I have authorized a 90-day pause." The president here announcing a 90-day pause.
Needless to say, I had filmed an alternate ending for this video, and I could have simply just aired the video as is, but given all of the chaos and change that has happened in just the past 48 hours, I feel like I wanted to amend my conclusion slightly. As I'm sure you are all aware, on Wednesday, April 9th, despite saying,
I don't want anything to go down. But sometimes you have to take medicine to fix something.
He did, in fact, cave, pausing the tariffs for 90 days, with the exception of the ongoing dispute with China and the blanket base tariff of 10%. Many of you will likely come to the conclusion that all of this tariff mess was just simply, at the end of the day, about market manipulation. And truly, I can see why that is a likely conclusion. After all, you don't just make a social media post telling all of your faithful followers to buy now hours before reversing your tariff so that the markets dramatically rebound. Which, of course, the faithful followers and wealthy inner circle, with the means and access of stockbrokers to do so, followed that direction to huge financial success.
This is S𝗨𝗣𝗣𝗢𝗥𝗧. It's not just a company, it's actually an individual. And he made $2.5 billion today, and he made $900 million. That's not bad. He's a financial.
But despite this development, I still personally hold the viewpoint that had the wealthy billionaires in the United States not gotten so yippy, his words, by the way, not mine, I do think Trump probably would have still stayed the course. And given that this is actually only a 90-day pause, I still think that it's really incredibly relevant and, if anything, even more important to talk about what this might mean for the future of US and EU trading, because after all, this isn't technically over. We just may have bought ourselves a little bit more time. In my opinion, looking forward, it's clear that nothing seems to be off the table for the Trump administration to browbeat trade partners into submission and weaponize the dollar to get what he wants. He's done it once, he's done it twice, and I feel confident in saying that I think he'll do it again. More tariffs, withdrawing military support through NATO. Quite frankly, I wouldn't be surprised in the near future if we see Trump do and say things like withholding access to the dollar or the American market in order to punish adversaries or to coerce ungrateful allies.
You said thank you once this
A lot
entire
of
meeting?
times.
No, in this
Even
entire meeting, have
today,
you said thank
even-
you?
If it does go that far, which admittedly is a gigantic if, the question I have moving forward is, what is the EU going to be able to do about it? What kind of cards do they have to play if things escalate to that kind of situation? And at least in the past couple of days, they have showed us their hand a little bit. Prior to the pause, the EU placed a 25% tariff on U.S. steel and aluminum and an additional 10 to 25% tariff on all other American goods. These, of course, are paused for the time being. However, the EU also made it clear that they were very much prepared to take things even further. Notably, also just before the pause, European Parliament said that if the tariffs continued any longer, Europe would have to consider entering into an alliance with China against the United States. They then reached out to Beijing for help containing the trade war. Spain decided to pursue closer trade ties with China, rejecting a warning from the US that doing so would be, quote, cutting your own throat. It's pretty clear that the EU is prepared to look elsewhere than just across the Atlantic to strengthen its economic and trade ties. And given all of the chaos and insults and instability coming from the American administration, I don't think very many people could blame them at this point. But then the next question would be, is it going to be enough to reorganize world trade as we know it? To that, I'm not so sure. The dollar's strength comes from a century of proactive, sometimes aggressive, offshore monetary policy. The US dollar still accounts for 88% of cross-border trade and 58% of global reserves. The US government has $34 trillion in debt, $21 trillion available as safe assets for global markets. China's bond market is the second largest, about $22 trillion, but most of that consists of local government and state-owned enterprise debt with limited foreign access. The Eurozone comes next with almost $13 trillion in total debt, but only 4 trillion euros is counted as safe. According to most economic experts, this is nowhere near enough to replace the dollar, and it would take an incredible amount of might to find a way to promote a euro-dominated global payment and credit system. For now, US cash is still king. And in the past few days, it has become extraordinarily clear that the United States will use whatever leverage they have possible to make sure that the dollar still sits on the throne, including potentially flushing our international trade ties down the toilet. But this is an incredibly fast-evolving and ever-changing economic landscape, and I would love to hear your thoughts down below in the comment section of this video. And as always, if you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, and for more content from Tarriffic, hit that subscribe button. So, I'll see you next Sunday. Cheers!
I'm telling you, these countries are calling us up, kissing my ass. They are dying to make a deal. Please, please, sir, make a deal. I'll do anything. I'll do anything, sir. And then I'll see some rebel Republican, some guy that wants to grandstand, say, I think that Congress should take over negotiations. Let me tell you, you don't negotiate like I negotiate.